Alright guys, so today we're going to learn how to solve polynomials given a 0 or 2, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a polynomial and I'm going to give you all the real zeros, and you have to find all the complex or rational zeros, okay? There is one where I'm going to give you an imaginary and you have to find the real, okay? So I taught you synthetic division, and I taught you that synthetic division helps you factor polynomials. What actually helps you solve a polynomial, which to solve a polynomial you need to factor it, and some of them don't have a perfect square or they're difference of cubes, so you need synthetic division to solve. Okay, now how do you know how many roots a polynomial has? It has as many roots as the degree of the function. Okay, so if I could get this to work. So number one, so I give you the polynomial 54x cubed minus 2. And I tell you that 1, 0 is x equals 1/3. Okay? So this is a cubic. Okay, I know that by the highest degree of the function, or the highest exponent of the function, which is the degree. So my highest exponent is 3. So there are 3 solutions to this polynomial. All right, so when I give it to you in x equals form, you do not have to switch the sign. So I'm going to put 1/3 in my box. Now, I notice that I go from x cubed to no x, so I need 2 placeholders here for the squared term and the linear term. So I have 54, and here's the squared term, here's the linear term, and then there's your constant term. Okay, so we draw our line. You always drop down that first number. So then I'm going to say 54 times 1/3. And I get 18. Then we add. 0 plus 18 is 18. 1/3 times 18 is 6. Drop it down or add it. 1/3 times 6 is 2. And then negative 2 plus 2 is 0, which that is correct because we learned yesterday with the remainder and factor theorem that if your remainder is 0, then what you just divided by was a factor. And I told you 1/3 was a factor, and there it just proved it. Okay? Now, when you do synthetic division, it drops your original polynomial down 1 degree. So I go from a cubed to a squared. So now I have 54x squared plus 18x plus 6. You can factor, but we know the quadratic formula solves it every time, so I'm going to stick with the quadratic formula. So it's opposite b, so opposite b plus or minus the square root. Always put this b in parentheses in case it's negative. Then it's minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Now when I do the quadratic formula, I simplify it in 3 sections because you never know if you're going to have an imaginary number, because with these you can have imaginary numbers. Okay, so negative 18 needs no simplification, so we just drop it down. So we have negative 18 plus or minus. I do not touch the radical yet because, again, if it's a negative, your calculator is going to tell you it's an unreal solution. So I just type what is underneath the radical. So I'm going to say 18 squared minus 4 times 54 times 6. And I get, I did something wrong. So I typed it in, I just mistyped a number, and I get negative 972. See, if you had typed this all in, your calculator would have told you invalid. And it's all over 2 times 54, which is 108. Okay? Now, we're going to have to break down negative 972. Okay? So we come to the side over here. And I'm going to break 972 down. Okay? So 972. what you're trying to do is you're trying to break it down until you find a perfect square root. And your perfect square roots are your 4, your 16, your 9, your 25, your 36, your 49, 64, 81. I suggest knowing all the way up to 12 for your perfect squares, okay? And the way I'm finding them is just 12 squared is 144. 11 squared is 121. 10 squared is 100. So those are your perfect squares, 100, 121, 144, okay? So I'm trying to break it down until I find those perfect squares. So when I have a large number, I do start with 2 just because I know it's an even number and it is divisible by 2. So I do 2 and 486, and you can do it different ways. I just find this is easy. 2 and 243. I mean, it does take a hot minute, but it'll be all right. So then, now that is not divisible by 2, but it is divisible by 3, and I get 3 and 81. Now, 81 is a perfect square, okay? What two numbers multiply to give me 81? That is 9 and 9, okay? So, once you find your perfect square, you stop, okay? Then you circle your pairs. I have a pair of 2s and I have a pair of 9s. All right. So that means I'm going to pull out a 2 and I'm going to pull out a 9, and 2 times 9 will be 18. So I can pull out 18. Now, if you noticed, 3 was left by itself. It stays underneath the radical. Okay. Now, this negative. We have learned in previous lessons that that square root of a negative is actually an I. Okay, so when I pull that negative out, I'm going to pull an I out. So I have negative 18 plus or minus 18I times the square root of whatever's left over, which is 3, all over 108. Now, simplifying, sometimes y'all mess up a little bit. Now, you learned in Math 2 that you cannot touch anything underneath that radical, okay? That radical has to be gone before you can touch anything underneath it, like simplification-wise, unless you have a square root underneath there, okay? So when you reduce this down, you have to look at 3 sections. You look at this section, and this section. Do they have something in common that I can divide them by, okay? And they do. They're all divisible by, I do believe, 18. Yes, they're all divisible by 18. So negative 18 divided by 18 is negative 1. 18 divided by 18 is 1. I can put it, but you don't need it. It's 1i times the square root of 3 over 108 divided by 18 is 6. And that's as far as you can go. Okay? So my answer, let's change. So my answer for number 1 will be x equals the number I gave you, which is 1/3. And then what you have when you did the quadratic formula. Negative 1 plus or minus I times the square root of 3 over 6 is my answer. And that plus or minus just means there are 2 of those. So you do have 3 zeros. 1, 2, 3. Okay? And that is your answer for number 1. All right. Let's go on to number 2. All right, let's see here. Number 2.
I can learn to understand you much better if I
No.
get familiar with the way you talk.
Oh no.
Your permission to help.
All right, sorry about that, guys. Number 2. So number 2 is going to be x cubed plus 6x squared plus 21x plus 26. And I'm going to give you a 0, which is x equals negative 2. Alright, so again, this degree is 3. So that means I'm going to have 3 answers. So I've given you 1, so now we're looking for 2 more. Okay? So I put negative 2 in the box. and I count it down. I go 3, 3, 2, 1, 0. So I don't need a placeholder in this one. Now you're looking for your coefficient. If there's not a coefficient, we have an understood 1, and then 6, and then 21, and then 26. Draw your line, drop the first number down, then multiply. Negative 2 times 1 is negative 2. Then add, that gives me 4. Negative 2 times 4 is negative 8. And then we're going to add, we're going to say 21 plus negative 8, which is negative 13. Multiply that by negative 2, we get negative 26. Now, a good way to check yourself to make sure you're doing it right is you should always, when you do synthetic division on solving polynomials, you should get a 0 as your remainder every time, okay? Because these should be factors. If you do not get a 0, either you did something wrong or you need to check your factor, okay? All right, so I'll go from a cube to a quadratic. So now I have x squared plus 4x plus 13. You can look at this one and see if you can factor it, but 13 is prime, so it's not factorable. Okay, so I'm going to do the quadratic formula. We do opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Again, simplify your 3 parts. Negative 4 can't be simplified, so we just put negative 4 plus or minus. Type what's underneath the radical. Do not type the radical yet in your calculator. I get negative 36 all over 2. Now, 36 is a perfect square. The square root, so we're going to come, I love my side thoughts. Whoops. Oh, undo. I don't know what just happened, guys, so let's redo it. That's going to be over 2 times 1. And then I've got negative 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 36 over 2. All right, so 36 is a perfect square, okay? So the square root of positive 36 is a 6. So that means the square root of negative 36 is the same thing, but that negative turns into an I. So it is negative, so it's positive 6i. Okay, so the square root of negative 36 is 6i. All right. So come over here, which is the plus or minus 6i, but your quadratic equation, quadratic formula handles that for you. So it's negative 4 plus or minus 6i all over 2. So I have nothing underneath the radical, which is okay. All right. You look at your 3 sections, negative 4, 6, and 2. They are all divisible by 2. So negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3. And then 2 divided by 2 is just 1, so I don't need to do anything. So my quadratic formula reduces down to this. That plus or minus handles my last 2 zeros. So my answer is the 0 I gave you, which was negative 2. And then what you got when you did the quadratic formula, negative 2 plus or minus 3i. And that is your answer. Okay? All right, let's go to a higher order polynomial. Okay? I'm just going to go to a new page. All right, so number 3 is going to be a 4th degree polynomial. Okay? You know I like my different colors. Let's try this one. All right, so number 3. Number 3 is going to be x to the 4th plus 2x cubed plus 21x squared plus 72x minus 540 Now with a fourth degree polynomial, I am going to give you two zeros. And I'm going to tell you in the next unit where I get those two zeros from, because the next unit is the graphing unit. So my zeros are x equals 3 and -5. Okay? All right, so now I know synthetic division drops my degree down by 1 each time. Well, if I start with a fourth degree polynomial, I'm going to have to drop it down twice to get it to a quadratic so I can do the quadratic formula. Okay, so in this one, we're going to do the synthetic division twice. That's why I gave you two zeros. Okay, so it is a fourth degree polynomial, so that means I should have 4 answers. I already have half of them. It does not matter which zero you start with. I'm going to start with 3 instead of the negative. Leave the negative for the lesser polynomial degree. So I'm going to put 3 in my box. Now it counts down 4, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So we're good. So I have 1, 2, 21, 72, and -540. Okay? Drop down your 1. 1 times 3 is 3. 3 plus 2 is 5. 3 times 5 is 15. 21 plus 15 is 36. 36 times 3 is 108. Add the 72. I get 180. 180 times 3 is 540. And the positive 540 and the negative 540 cancel out to a 0. Now, since I'm doing synthetic division again, you don't have to form your equation yet, okay? Because that's still a cubic. So we went from a quartic to a cubic. Okay, I have to get to a quadratic, so I can do the quadratic formula or factor, okay? So we're going to do synthetic again, and I'm going to do it with -5, and you can just leave it just like this, okay? So I drop the 1 down. 1 times -5 is -5. That gives me 0. Well, 0 times -5 is 0. 0 plus 36 is 36. And then 36 times -5 is -180, which is 0, which is what I wanted. Okay? So now I went from a quartic to a cubic. Now I'm to a quadratic. So now I have 1x squared, which you do not have to write the 1, so we're going to say x squared. This is a 0 linear term. Let me write it so you can see it. 0x plus 36. I don't need that 0x, so technically I just have x squared plus 36. Now, when you do not have that middle term is what I just crossed out, okay? When you don't have that middle term, you can just solve it like you solve for x normally. So I'm going to say x squared plus 36 equals 0. We're going to subtract that 36 on both sides. I get x squared equals -36. Well, how do you get rid of a squared? A square root. So we square root both sides. We just talked about the square root of -36. So x will equal, and I told you in earlier units, and even counted it off on your test, when you take the square root of a number, you always have the plus or minus. So x equals plus or minus 6i. If you forget that plus or minus, you are forgetting a 0, and you will be deducted points. Okay? So that handles my last two zeros right there. So my answer is x equals the two zeros I gave you, which is 3, -5, and then you can write it out if you want to, positive 6i and -6i. And that are your 4 answers right there for your quartic. Okay? All right, so we're going to do one more. Okay, we're going to do one more quartic. All right. So let's go to another fun color pen. Let's try one of these sparklies. All right, so let's see if you can see this one. So number 4, it's not too bad. Number 4 is, I'm going to give you 4x to the 4th minus 11x cubed minus 12x squared plus 52x, and then minus 32. And since it's a quartic, I'm going to give you 2 zeros. X equals 2 and 2. So there's a double root at 2. All right, so I'm going to use 2 twice, which is fine. It happens all the time. You learned in math too that when the quadratic touches the x-axis, it's a double root. Okay, same thing with a polynomial, which we'll learn in the next unit. When the polynomial's curve touches the x-axis, you have a double root. Okay, so we are going to use, so it really doesn't matter who you use first, does it? So 2, count it down, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, we're good. So I've got 4, negative 11, negative 12, 52, and negative 32. Draw your line. Drop the 4 down. 2 times 4 is 8. Negative 11 plus 8 is negative 3. Negative 3 times 2 is negative 6. Negative 6 plus negative 12 is negative 18. Times that by 2, you get negative 36. Negative 36 plus 52 is 16. 16 times 2 is positive 32. And those two cancel out, and I'm left with 0, which is what we wanted. All right, so I've done one of the 2's. Now let's do the other 2. So I'm going to put my little other 2 here. Draw your line. Drop your 4 down. 2 times 4 is 8. 8 plus negative 3 is 5. 2 times 5 is 10. 10 plus negative 18 is negative 8. Negative 8 times 2 is negative 16. And these cancel out in the end, which is what we wanted. So we started with a quartic. This was a cubed. Okay, so that would have been x cubed if we had had that there. That looks horrible. So if we had written this out, okay, that would have been an x cubed. And now we're down to an x squared, which is what we want, okay? So I now have 4x squared plus 5x minus 8, okay? So I am going to use the quadratic formula to solve this, okay? So I've got opposite b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay? So, simplifying your 3 spots. Negative 5 can't be simplified, so we just drop it down. Square root, we do not type that radical in because if it's an imaginary number, your calculator is not going to compute it. Neither will Desmos. I get 153 all over 8. Now, 153 is not a perfect square, so I'm going to have to break down 153. So I come over here to the side, and I'm going to do my factor tree. 153. So 153 is divisible by 3, so we have 3 and 51. 51 is also divisible by 3. Which is 3 times 17. Now, 17 is prime. You cannot break it down because your factor tree is what you're doing is you're breaking it down to all primes or you're breaking it down to a perfect squared. Okay, since I took the route of the 3, I didn't get my perfect square. But you go back to your pairs. I have a pair of 3's, so that means I can bring a 3 out. And 17 stays underneath. So, I now have negative 5 plus or minus. There's no negative, so there will be no I. So all I can pull out is a 3. I leave the 17 underneath and divide it by 8. I look at my 3 hot spots. They are not all divisible by the same thing, okay? So that means you're done. So you have your 4 answers now. X equals the two numbers I gave you, which is 2 and 2, and then that what you had left over for your quadratic formula. -5 plus or minus 3 times the square root of 17 all over 8. And that is your final answer. All right. So what I would like you guys to work on and turn into me. You can email it to me. You can drop it in Canvas. I'll have a drop thing on Canvas you can do. Okay. So on your own, I'm going to give you 3 problems to do. X cubed plus 64 equals 0, and I'm going to tell you x equals -4 is a factor. Number 2 is going to be 3x cubed minus 4x squared minus 17x plus 6, and I'm going to tell you x equals +3. And then the last one is going to be a quartic. It's going to be x to the 4th minus 3x cubed plus 6x squared minus 48x minus 160. And you're going to have 2 solutions here. X equals 5 and -2. All right. So do those on your own. If you have any questions, email me or message me on Canvas. All right, guys.